The morning sunlight spilled across the quiet suburban street, washing the storefronts in a soft golden hue, making everything seem a little more alive. The bell above the door of Maple and Bean Cafe chimed as Ethan Walker pushed it open with his shoulder,
Find the smoker and troll her.
balancing his daughter's small backpack in one hand while holding her tiny fingers in the other. 6-year-old Sophie skipped beside him, her braids bouncing with each step. She hummed a tune that only she seemed to know, a cheerful rhythm that had been stuck in her head since breakfast. Ethan, tall and broad-shouldered, still in his worn work boots and flannel shirt, smiled faintly at the sound. He didn't hum along, he had too much on his mind, but Sophie's presence was always enough to soften the sharp edges of his thoughts. Life as a single dad wasn't easy. Not a day went by that Ethan didn't feel the pull of exhaustion. He worked long hours as a construction supervisor, balancing paperwork and physical labor, only to come home to a quiet apartment that Sophie filled with laughter. It wasn't the life he had imagined at 22, but it was a life he was proud of. Sophie was his anchor, his reason for getting out of bed each morning. "Daddy, can I get a muffin today?" Sophie asked, tugging at his sleeve. Her brown eyes wide, full of innocence that often made Ethan give in before he even had a chance to argue. He chuckled, brushing a stray strand of hair from her forehead. "You had a muffin yesterday, kiddo. How about some oatmeal instead?" She pouted dramatically, hands on her hips, ready to argue. Ethan raised an eyebrow, about to say no, but then sighed. "Fine, one muffin, but you have to share it with me." Her grin lit up the room, brighter than the morning Sunday. "Deal." The cafe was busier than usual. The hum of conversation mixed with the hiss of the espresso machine. Ethan guided Sophie to their usual corner table by the window. He liked sitting there because he could watch Sophie while keeping an eye on the street. At another table, a woman sat quietly, a folded newspaper in her lap, and a cappuccino cooling beside her. She didn't seem to belong in this little cafe, her posture too perfect, her clothes too tailored, but she deliberately dressed down. A simple cream sweater, dark jeans, sunglasses resting on the table. Her name was Charlotte Hayes, though no one here knew it. To the public, Charlotte was a name that appeared in business magazines, whispered in Wall Street circles, and printed on Forbes lists. She was a billionaire, the heiress of Hayes Global Investments, a conglomerate that owned half of downtown skyscrapers and international tech startups. But today she wasn't Charlotte Hayes the mogul. Today she was just a woman who wanted to drink coffee without anyone bowing to her, without cameras flashing in her face. And yet, anonymity was tricky. Even now, she caught the sideways glances of two young men at the counter. They probably didn't recognize her, but they recognized beauty, elegance, or maybe vulnerability. Charlotte shifted uncomfortably, lowering her gaze to the newspaper. Ethan didn't notice her at first. He was too busy cutting Sophie's muffin in half, trying to make the pieces equal so she wouldn't accuse him of cheating. But he noticed when Sophie pointed at Charlotte's table and whispered, "Daddy, that lady looks sad." He followed her gaze. The woman didn't look sad, exactly more like guarded, distant, as though she was fighting a battle no one else could see. Ethan gave Sophie a small smile. "Not everyone who looks sad is sad, Bug. Sometimes people just have a lot on their minds." But Sophie, in her stubborn way, declared, "She needs a friend." Before Ethan could stop her, Sophie hopped down from her chair and trotted toward Charlotte's table. Ethan sighed, muttering, "Sophie," but didn't chase her. Sophie had a knack for breaking down the barriers that adults carefully built. Charlotte looked up in surprise as a small hand rested on the edge of her table. "Hi," Sophie beamed. "Do you want to sit with us?" "My daddy says muffins taste better when you share them." Charlotte blinked, caught off guard. Children were unpredictable. But something about Sophie's bright smile tugged at her. She glanced past the little girl to where Ethan sat, looking half apologetic, half ready to retrieve his daughter. Charlotte smiled faintly. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to intrude." Sophie shook her head fiercely. "It's not intruding, if you're invited." Ethan finally stood, walking over. "Sorry about that. Sophie's got a habit of, making friends faster than I can stop her. Charlotte looked up at him then. Really looked. His presence was grounding. Solid. A man in his 30s with dark hair and a rugged jawline. Wearing clothes that had seen better days. Not polished, not fake. Real. No harm done, Charlotte said softly, her voice smooth but reserved. Ethan gave a polite nod, about to lead Sophie back, when one of the men from the counter approached Charlotte's table. He was tall, overconfident, and his smile had an edge that immediately set Ethan on alert. "Hey, sweetheart," the man drawled, leaning one hand on Charlotte's table. "Haven't seen you around here before? Mind if we join you?" Charlotte stiffened. "I'd rather be alone, thank you." The man ignored her protest. His friend snickered behind him. "Come on, don't be like that. We're just being friendly." Ethan felt something in his chest tighten. He didn't like the way the guy was looming over her. He didn't like the way Charlotte's shoulders tensed, or how her hand curled into a fist on her lap. Sophie clung to his leg, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Without thinking too much, Ethan stepped forward. She said no. His voice was calm, but carried a weight that made both men glance at him. The taller one sneered. "Who asked you, man?" Ethan's eyes didn't waver. "I don't need to be asked. She's clearly not interested. Leave her alone." The tension in the cafe thickened. A few customers looked up, sensing trouble. The barista hesitated, with a tray of cups in her hands. The man puffed up his chest, but something in Ethan's steady stare made him hesitate. There was no bravado in Ethan's expression, no empty threat, just quiet certainty. The kind of certainty that came from a man who had fought harder battles than this. After a beat, the guy scoffed and muttered, "Whatever. Not worth it." He jerked his chin at his friend, and the two retreated to the far end of the cafe. Charlotte exhaled slowly, her grip on the newspaper loosening. She hadn't needed saving. Not really. She had dealt with worse. And yet, the way Ethan had stepped in without hesitation stirred something unfamiliar in her chest. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ethan shrugged. "Don't mention it." He glanced at Sophie, who was still clutching his leg. "Come on, Bug. Let's finish our muffin." But Sophie wasn't ready to retreat. She tilted her head up at Charlotte. "You can sit with us now. Daddy doesn't mind." Charlotte laughed softly, a sound that surprised even her. For the first time in a long while, she felt something crack in the armor she had carefully built. "I suppose one muffin couldn't hurt," she murmured. And so, Charlotte Hayes, the billionaire no one recognized, and Ethan Walker, the single dad who thought she was just another stranger, sat together at a corner table in a little cafe. Neither of them knew it yet, but that small act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. For 3 days after the incident at Maple and Bean Cafe, mornings began to follow a new rhythm. Ethan hadn't meant for it to happen. But there it was. The small ritual of arriving at the cafe with Sophie, ordering the same oat cappuccino and blueberry muffin, and scanning the room with a glance he pretended wasn't searching. And there she would be, Charlotte, seated by the window or along the wall, pretending to read a newspaper folded to yesterday's business section. On a different life path, they might have exchanged business cards and parted ways. In this one, they exchanged half a muffin on day 2 and laughter on day 3. No one knew Charlotte. Not the barista who called her Miss Cream Sweater. Not the regular who tried to guess her job, graphic designer, historian, consultant. Not the college kids who flinched when they noticed Ethan walk in. And certainly not Ethan, who filed her neatly in the part of his mind labeled, "Good things that happen. Once in a while." Good things that belong to the world outside bills, outside the grind of the construction site, outside custody papers he never had to use because his ex-wife disappeared into her new life, with a graciousness none of them had expected. Good things that looked like a woman whose smile made time do interesting things. On the 4th morning, the rain arrived. It wasn't the polite kind that misted the air, it was choppy and determined, drumming on the cafe awning and leaving tiny rivers along the sidewalk. Maple and Bean's bell chimed a little desperate tune every time someone ducked inside. wet umbrellas blooming like defeated flowers by the doorway. Sophie, in her little yellow raincoat with dinosaur prints, stamped both feet into the mat and announced, "I am a puddle warrior," which made the barista laugh and put a foam heart on her hot chocolate. Charlotte was later that day. Ethan checked the time twice, reminding himself he had a site meeting at 9:30 and couldn't wait forever. He told himself he wasn't waiting at all. He told himself a lot of things. Then the bell chimed, and the rain made room for her like the storm itself had stepped aside. Charlotte entered with her hood thrown back, hair damp and darker at the ends, a faint flush on her cheeks that made her look less carved from marble and more like a person who forgot she was beautiful when she ran for cover. She spotted Sophie waving at her like an airport signal officer and smiled in defeat. "Good morning," Charlotte said, tugging off her raincoat. "How's my favorite puddle warrior?" "I vanquished 6 puddles," Sophie declared solemnly, "and one of them hissed." "Hissed?" Ethan echoed, amused. "It probably just bubbled." Sophie narrowed her eyes. "It hissed." Charlotte set her bag down and slipped into the seat opposite them. A quiet movement that felt like a choice. The cafe buzzed around them, all steam and chatter. For a while, the three of them existed in that warm pocket, Sophie describing recess politics with the serious authority of a small queen. Ethan listening and smiling, Charlotte adding questions that made Sophie feel important. "What do you do?" Sophie asked suddenly, turning to Charlotte with the blunt curiosity only children were brave enough to wield. Ethan's gaze flicked up, a question he'd managed not to ask for 4 days. Charlotte's answer was smooth. "I help people decide where to put their money, so it grows into bigger money." "So you're a farmer," Sophie concluded. "But with money." Charlotte blinked and then laughed, surprised by the accuracy. "Yes," she said. "Money farmer." Ethan hid a smile behind his cup. "Is that a stressful crop?" "Only during droughts," Charlotte replied, playing along, "and floods, and when the soil turns to quicksand, and when someone tries to set the field on fire and then sell you rain." "So, Tuesdays," Ethan said. "Precisely." They lingered longer than they should have. At 9:15, Ethan jolted and checked his watch. "I have to drop Sophie and get to the site," he said. Regret creeping into his tone. That regret shocked him a little. He wasn't in the habit of wanting more of anything he couldn't have. Wanting led to foolishness, and foolishness led to overtime shifts to patch the holes. "There's a supply delivery, and the city inspector is stopping by." "Which site?" Charlotte asked, casual curiosity covering a sudden spark of interest. "Holbrook and 5th, he said, rising. "They're converting the old warehouse into mixed-use retail. It's one of the few projects that might actually be good for the neighborhood." Charlotte knew the developer. Of course she did. Hayes Global had declined to invest too many contingencies, not enough transparency in the cap table, yet she'd quietly checked the site plan because it sat on a corner she once passed as a child on the way to the community pool. She could see the blueprint in her head now. Load. Bearing brick. Retrofitted with steel framing. Mezzanine levels. Flexible retail footprints. A microgrocery that would undercut the bodega unless it carried bodega staples. Someone, somewhere, had named it Holbrook Market at the 5th. Someone else had green-lit, bespoke artisanal signage, which meant faux vintage lettering at triple the cost. She hated and loved those details. The romance and the cynicism braided together. "I might walk that way," she said. "A beat. If you don't mind." Ethan hesitated only a second. "I don't." They left together. Sophie in the middle, holding both their hands like a happy conspiracy. The rain had softened to a fine silver thread, the kind that whispered rather than shouted. At the school gate, Sophie squeezed Ethan's fingers, then Charlotte's, and announced, "I will collect more data on puddles," before sprinting into the building and waving through the glass like a tiny, frantic lighthouse. Ethan watched her until she rounded the corner. His shoulders dropped slightly, the line of quiet vigilance relaxing now that his world was in safe hands for a few hours. "Thanks for walking with us," he said. "Thank you for the muffin tax," Charlotte replied. "I'm now morally obligated to return the favor next time." Ethan scratched his jaw. Careful. That's how you end up friends with us. Charlotte looked away quickly, as if something about that word friends had tugged a stitch loose. Friends. She had acquaintances, allies, adversaries, mentors, mentees, board members, family, employees, exes, the occasional almost relationship that soured under the heat lamps of her life. Friends would be unexpected, dangerous even, necessary, maybe. They walked the 6 blocks to the warehouse in not uncomfortable silence. The building loomed like a sleeping animal. Its bones good, but its skin tired. The contractor's sign flapped at the chain-link fence. A pile of steel studs sat under a tarp, and a crew in hard hats moved like chess pieces over a wet board. Ethan's posture changed as they approached. The way a musician's posture changes when he sees the stage more alert, more sure. He was in his element. Morning. He called to a lanky guy near the gate. Tell Mike I'm here. And remind everyone. The inspector's at 10. I want proper PPE. And no improvisational electrical art projects. The lanky guy, Jeremy, saluted with 2 fingers. Copy, boss. Charlotte took it all in. She stood a little back, out of the flow, watching Ethan scan the site, eyes catching a mis-stacked pallet, a slightly ajar panel box, a worker whose harness wasn't clipped properly. Ethan said something, not loudly but with a firmness that altered the landscape. Things changed because Ethan asked them to change. That was a skill that couldn't be purchased. You really know what you're doing, Charlotte said when he returned to her. Occupational survival, he replied. Wet steel and deadlines don't have a sense of humor. A delivery truck rumbled up then, spraying the curb with oily water. Ethan excused himself with a quick, "Give me 5, and went to meet it. Charlotte watched him direct the driver with precise gestures. A conductor late for his own symphony, but unwilling to rush the woodwinds. Her phone buzzed. She almost didn't check it, and then she did, which is how habits survive. Tara. Board call moved to 11:30. We need your take on the Montreal deal. Also, your photo was in a private Slack at Sable Capital last night. Someone thinks they saw you in Midtown. I shut it down, but for your information." Charlotte felt her stomach tighten, then loosen. The old reflex. Sable Capital employed alumni who still believed gossip was currency. To them, she was a silhouette with a number attached. The number had too many zeros for comfort, and the silhouette had too few edges for safety. She typed quickly. Charlotte. Not in Midtown. Taking a walk. I'll dial in at 11:30. She almost added, tell them to mind their own business. But that wasn't a sentence Tara needed to forward out of context someday. She slid the phone away and forced herself to breathe in the smell of rain and metal. Charlotte returned to her office building with a slight smile. There was something comfortable about the unexpected rhythm she'd found in her mornings with Ethan and Sophie. The rain had let up. And as she entered the building, she could still hear the soft echo of Ethan's voice in her head. Her uncle, Richard Hayes, was waiting for her in his office when she arrived. His expression was unreadable, but there was a certain calculation in his gaze as he surveyed her. Charlotte, he said, his voice polite but laced with something colder beneath. We need to talk about your recent activities. Charlotte leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest. What do you mean? The tabloids are already starting to talk. You're socializing with people who don't fit the image we've cultivated for you. You can't afford to make these personal connections. It reflects poorly on the company. Charlotte met his eyes, her own hardening. Ethan Walker is none of your concern. He's a good man, and he has nothing to do with Hayes Global. Richard's face tightened. It's not just about him. You're creating a distraction, one we can't afford. Charlotte rose from her seat, her voice calm but firm. This is my life, not a marketing campaign. I'll live it how I choose. Richard's gaze was sharp, the warning clear. Then prepare for the consequences. The board is already questioning your judgment. Charlotte stepped away from the desk, her heart heavy with the weight of her uncle's words. But she wasn't afraid. She'd already made her decision. Sophie was right. Sometimes you had to grab the moments that offered themselves. even if they were fleeting. Ethan and Charlotte had been walking together to the park with Sophie between them, chatting easily, when a car pulled up to the curb. A man stepped out, holding an envelope in his hand. Ethan recognized the man instantly. He was one of Richard's employees. "Miss Hayes," the man said coldly, his eyes scanning the park. "This is for you." Charlotte's heart sank, but she didn't show it. "Thank you," she said, taking the envelope and slipping it into her bag without a second glance. Ethan's jaw clenched as he watched the man walk away. "What was that about?" he asked. "It's nothing," Charlotte replied, her voice flat. "Just a reminder from my uncle." Ethan didn't press further. But a storm was brewing inside him. He could see how the weight of her family was bearing down on her. And it frustrated him. He wanted to protect her. But he knew she didn't need his protection. The next morning, they were back at Maple and Bean. As usual, Sophie was in high spirits, laughing about the antics of a classmate who couldn't stop making funny faces during story time. Charlotte was already there when Ethan and Sophie arrived. Her usual spot, by the window. "Hey, Charlotte," Sophie called, dashing over and sitting next to her with a big grin. "I saved you a muffin piece." Charlotte laughed, her heart lightening as Sophie offered her a bite of the muffin. "You're a lifesaver." Ethan slid into the seat opposite them, looking a little worn from the morning's work. He nodded at Charlotte. "Morning." "Morning," Charlotte said, her voice soft. She looked at him, wondering if he could tell something was wrong. Ethan caught her gaze, sensing the tension, but he didn't ask. There was something fragile about her today, something unspoken. Sophie continued her chatter about school, completely oblivious to the undercurrent of conversation that lay between the adults. As she spoke, Charlotte's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, seeing another message from her uncle. She sighed, shaking her head. "It's my uncle again. I swear, he doesn't know when to quit." Ethan glanced at the phone, then back at Charlotte. "You don't have to deal with him if you don't want to." Charlotte smiled, her eyes weary. "I don't know how not to, but I'll manage." They lingered over coffee for longer than usual, not speaking about the heavier topics that lingered in the air. Sophie was too busy making up imaginary stories about Professor Slime, her snail, and the many adventures he'd gone on since his sabbatical. Eventually, Charlotte stood, looking at both Ethan and Sophie. "I should get going," she said. "I have some things to take care of." Ethan stood as well, his gaze lingering on her. "Want me to walk you out?" Charlotte smiled faintly. "You don't have to." "I don't mind," Ethan said, his voice soft but insistent. As they walked out of the cafe, the world outside felt sharper, clearer. The city buzzed with its usual noise, but for a brief moment, everything seemed to fade into the background as Ethan and Charlotte walked side by side, Sophie skipping ahead with a newfound spring in her step. The night before the press conference, Charlotte sat alone in her apartment, staring at the envelope from her uncle on the table. She had yet to open it, knowing what was inside. More threats, more pressure. Her phone buzzed again. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. "Want to grab dinner tomorrow?" Charlotte hesitated, then typed back. "Spaghetti sounds good. It'll help me clear my head." The response was quick. "I'll bring dessert." Charlotte smiled, her chest feeling lighter than it had all day. A simple invitation. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The next morning, Charlotte stood in front of the cameras at the press conference. The bright lights of the room felt like a different world. But she wasn't the heiress today. She wasn't the billionaire. She was just Charlotte. The woman who had chosen her own path, and who, despite everything, had decided to stand her ground. She spoke candidly about her decisions, her life, and the importance of choosing authenticity over perception. The cameras flashed, and the questions came fast and sharp. But Charlotte remained steady. Ethan was waiting in the wings, watching her with a quiet pride. After the press conference, Charlotte found herself at Ethan's apartment. He opened the door, and the familiar smell of garlic and basil hit her immediately. "Hey," she said softly. I'm here. Sophie was already in the kitchen, setting the table with a big grin. Spaghetti time! Charlotte laughed, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. As they sat down to dinner, Ethan leaned over and whispered, We're all in this together now, right? Charlotte looked at him, meeting his gaze. Yes, she said softly. We are. Sophie grinned, holding up a forkful of pasta. Partners, right? Charlotte laughed. Partners. As they ate, the weight of the world seemed to lift just a little. For the first time in a long while, Charlotte felt like she could breathe. After the press conference, Charlotte found herself at Ethan's apartment. He opened the door, and the familiar smell of garlic and basil hit her immediately. Hey, she said softly. I'm here. Sophie was already in the kitchen, setting the table with a big grin. Spaghetti time. Charlotte laughed, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. As they sat down to dinner, Ethan leaned over and whispered, We're all in this together now, right? Charlotte looked at him, meeting his gaze. Yes, she said softly. We are. Sophie grinned, holding up a forkful of pasta. Partners, right? Charlotte laughed. Partners. As they ate, the weight of the world seemed to lift just a little. For the first time in a long while, Charlotte felt like she could breathe.